Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, another guest from the UK. His name is Larry O'Hara, and he is involved in the publication of both a hard book and also a website, the title of which is Notes from the Borderland, and it's the UK's premier parapolitical magazine, so it's definitely something that I'm very interested in. But in his most recent publication from issue 11, he's written an account I think is very important considering the Assange situation in the UK. But it's about the original rape allegations, and we're going to ask him about Assange and the reporting about those allegations. I was fortunate enough to watch a documentary about that, and I'm looking forward to Mr. O'Hara's opinion. Larry, are you there?
Yeah, I am here. Thank you. I suppose I should use my full title. I'm a doctor, a PhD.
Okay.
And I'm the editor of Notes from the Borderland.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I missed that. So
All right.
Editor, and the most recent one, I was just looking at the papers. You wrote the paper is The Guardian, Julian Assange, and the Swedish rape allegations and investigation. Can you talk about how you got interested and inform the listeners about what the essential allegations were, please?
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I'm interested in that is the Guardian newspaper, and I know they have an online website which has some credence abroad in the US as well as the UK, and they were one of the media partners that Julian Assange went to publicise his concerns, including that famous video of drones, bombing civilians. Mm-hmm. And what interested me was that the Guardian newspaper essentially befriended him, pretended they were in an equal relationship, and then did all they could to get hold of the WikiLeaks files from other sources. And then not only did they drop him, but what particularly interested me is that the premier investigative journalist at the time, somebody called Nick Davies, he got information on the, I'd say inverted commas, rape allegations against Julian Assange. He made very selective use of Swedish police documents, and he almost single-handedly used The Guardian to turn around the image of Julian Assange from somebody in the UK, and probably more broadly, of somebody who was, whatever his personal morals or whatever, was a crusader for truth and so on. They turned it round into him being a cowardly rapist, basically. And so what I did is I looked at the information that was publicly available, that's in English, never mind Swedish, publicly available when The Guardian wrote their articles having a go at him. And I dissected it, and I showed how what Nick Davies wrote was egregious disinformation and lies, and then it obviously raises the question on whose part is he doing it. And although it's probably, I don't know whether it might be seen as sacrilegious by the State Department, but there's a famous photograph, whether staged or not, I don't know, of President Obama in the White House with Hillary Clinton and all the others, and they're supposedly watching the live feed of when Osama bin Laden was executed.
Yes.
And what I did is I added a speech bubble to it, where one of the military people says to the president, it hasn't really worked on Assange, and he basically, I think it's Hillary Clinton, says, well, why don't we send in Nick Davies? And he certainly did as good a job in undermining Assange, a better job in undermining Assange's credibility among not all left liberal circles, but he certainly muddied the waters. And one of the ironies is that after the article. I wrote the article and did that sort of tongue-in-cheek image on the front cover. And one of our techniques we use in the magazine is something called detournement that I can explain if you want me to.
Please do.
I found out that subsequently that there was a report of a meeting where Hillary Clinton had actually considered or alleged or joked that maybe they should bomb Assange.
Should bomb him, yeah. They were going to drone strike him. She offered that. Somebody reported that, yeah.
Well,
it's within her character, yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, even if they weren't going to do it, the fact that she could raise it shows you I wasn't too off her mindset without even knowing it.
Right. Well, we know what she did in Libya, so...
oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we...
Yeah, well, I don't know whether you've caught this, but she's recently been in the US, in the UK, giving talks, getting deferentially treated by the UK media. And she was actually on the BBC the other day, and that there is a report which has been prepared by an intelligence committee of the UK Parliament, and it's into supposed Russian influence on British domestic politics, and the government has chosen not to publish it. And she was on the BBC going, "Oh, this is terrible. They should publish this." Well, what I thought when I heard that is, what about all the backhanders she's got from foreign oligarchs, right. Or I should say, what about they didn't ask her any questions about the American embassy in Libya? They just gave her a really I mean, as you may guess from my political stance, President Trump isn't somebody I'll be voting for anytime soon if I had a vote. But then I look at Hillary Clinton and I think to myself, I'm damn glad I didn't have a dog in that fight. I would really like to have chosen her.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that picture of them supposedly watching Osama bin Laden die, because they almost reenacted it exactly when they killed al-Baghdadi for the fourth or fifth time. I don't even know how many times they've dredged out the leader of ISIS and killed him over and over again. But they restaged this whole... The national defense elite looks serene, looking at a monitor. It's all propaganda. But interestingly, I've been looking into Nick Davies in relation to Robert Maxwell and his involvement.
So have I.
Yeah, so it's very interesting.
I haven't actually published much on it, but my take, I've got a load of stuff that I've written, but I haven't yet published. But my take on Nick Davies on Maxwell is that essentially Nick Davies, and he's now retired, but I was hoping, everybody else who's ever had a go at him, he's gone back at them. But he hasn't had a go back at me because he doesn't want to get into a firefight with me because he knows it wouldn't work. But basically, my understanding is he was leaked information. He made his career through getting leaked information. He was leaked information by somebody in the police because they didn't like a particular policeman called John Yates, who wasn't involved in the original phone hacking investigation. But he was leaked information and he just basically gone for him. But a lot of the basis of Nick Davies' stories are a bit like, actually, it's interesting that he claims that one of his heroes is Deep Throat, to do with Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein. But when I actually looked into that, I thought what was interesting about that is, didn't it come out that Deep Throat wasn't a concerned citizen, but was a deputy director of the FBI who had an axe to grind. Now, you see, one of the things I wouldn't call our magazine journalism. I prefer to call it research. And one of the things that troubles me is that a lot of stuff which gets said to be investigative journalism isn't really investigating. It's being spoon-fed stuff by different factions of the state. And then the art is in dressing it up as though it's investigation when it's not.
Yes, exactly. Well, there's there's a Nicholas Davies and there's a Nick Davies, right?
Yeah. One of them, the Nicholas Davies, has written about stuff in Northern Ireland to do with, And again, what you're talking about there is you've got all these different sections of the security apparatus, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the old Special Branch, MI6, MI5, Army Intelligence, all at each other's throats. And of course, what there's a great history of, and the Guardian's very helpful in this, of course, is what you do is you pick on a defunct police squad that no longer exists. Right. And then you uncover loads of crimes that some of which may well have happened, that you can attribute to them, and your readers think that you're really, on the money,
right.
Up to the minute. Whereas, of course, the squads that you go for are ones that no longer exist or aren't important anymore. And so
But Nicholas Davies is not the same as Nick Davies, right? Isn't
no,
that
they're different people.
Okay. Because that's The Death of a Tycoon, an insider's account of the fall of Robert Maxwell by Nicholas Davies. That's one. But
I might have read that one, but it's the Nick Davies one. The Guardian journalist is the one who had the most most effect in terms of his book is called Hack Attack. I think it was made into a dreadful film which lionised them, and in the UK it was Nick Davies' work in collusion with somebody who's actually involved in UK politics now, trying to position himself to take over the Labour Party if Jeremy Corbyn doesn't win the next election, called Keir Starmer, who was a director of public prosecutions. And he basically I've always watched him with great been very perturbed by him, and he's the one who collaborated with Nick Davies to try and blame the police for stuff that the Crown Prosecution Service were at least as responsible for, which Nick Davies was happy to do, of course.
Right. The Hack Attack, How the Truth Caught Up with Rupert Murdoch, published 2014.
Yeah, that's right.
But he was involved with leaks involving Maxwell and Mordecai Vanunu, who was the nuclear secrets leaker.
I know Vanunu. I'm not sure whether it was that Nick Davies. It may have been, but it doesn't ring a bell. Nicholas Davies sounds more likely. It's a bit confusing that they've got similar names.
Well, Nicholas Davies recently passed away, so I know that he's gone to his eternal rest. But Nick Davies is definitely around, because I reached out to him thinking he was Nicholas Davies, and he said no. So
he's still got a Twitter account.
Yeah, so that's how. So I was in contact with him this year because I'm trying to figure out. Obviously, Robert Maxwell is huge news here, and the Epstein story isn't going away. You want to talk about parapolitics, but it is interesting, this whole Julian Assange and how it got turned, because in my research of the original Swedish charges, they were totally bogus, and the girls were willing participants in spending time with Assange. And Assange back then, in his healthier, hale days, was a bit of a ladies' man, so to speak.
He was a bit of a lad,
Yeah. So
I think you've got to differentiate between his personal morality, which and whether it was rape or not. Because the interesting person, I don't think the case was proven beyond reasonable doubt, but I think there are reasonable questions to be asked about Anna Ardan, who then went to a different part of Sweden to give a statement to a policewoman friend, and who did have previous links with Cuban dissident groups. I certainly think that there is, it's reasonable to speculate that it might have been a put-up job by American intelligence agencies. But the whole point is, even if it wasn't, I think there's enough holes in Ardan's testimony, because the other woman didn't really want to press any charges at all.
Yeah, there were two.
There's enough holes in Ardan's testimony to make you think that this was... and of course, what Assange said was, they're just using this to get me to the US. And of course, the likes of Nick Davies said, oh, no, of course not.
And that's exactly what's happening now. Yeah. Like, it's just a matter of time. Yeah. If he survives, if Julian survives, is fortunate enough to make it to the U.S. But I think that one of the charges claims was that he did not use a condom in their carnal relations, and that was what they were using for rape. So it wasn't a question of willingness or unwillingness or no. It was some kind of absurd, trumped up charge. And those women were, I think they were at their house. So they invited them back both to their apartments.
Yeah, I think it was separately. I think one of the possible dynamics of it is that when the second woman, the one who's had the police connections, when she found out he'd been with somebody else, well, she was the one who actually sent out a tweet, wasn't she? I've got the most exciting man in the world. We're having a crayfish party. Right. And I do think there is an account which was in English. I've forgotten the name momentarily of the guy, but of a Swedish journalist, I think, who dissected her various accounts and was in associate affairs and just didn't find them credible.
But my understanding too is that she, the second one, Ardern, was back with him supposedly after she was assaulted. So
she's right.
Right. So,
that's right.
So she's back in a fawning thing. He was like a little kind of a mini rock star, giving talks and being feted around the cafes of Stockholm or wherever he was in Sweden. But it was kind of like these were his kind of little intelligentsia groupies, so to speak, in a way. It seemed like that to me.
Yeah, that's right.
So, so those charges are bogus, and they all got turned by the media, even here in the States, that he was brought up on rape charges, but they were supercilious at best. It's just not...
the whole definition of rape, that was, operating in Sweden then, and possibly now, is rather different than that which might obtain elsewhere.
What do you mean by that? How is it different?
Well, I think I remember that, consensual sex, sex without a condom, I think in some circumstances in Sweden could be defined as rape, whereas it wouldn't be elsewhere, because you'd say, well, if you didn't want to engage in sex, then without a condom, then you wouldn't at all.
Right.
I think that was it wouldn't even be a charge in most countries.
Right. So it's a more stringent standard.
The whole word means something different,
Yeah, and do you remember the years of those? I don't recollect exactly the dates of those claims, but they hounded him with those for all the way up until today.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the...
I'm trying to think. I think it was those charges are like almost 10 or 15 years old. Like they're super old.
Not quite that old.
Okay.
I'll just see if I can find it.
Yeah. But yeah, it's I can't remember the name of the documentary I saw about it, but I was, obviously I think that
2010.
2010
is when he was in Sweden. Yeah.
So, it's those are remarkable. But the way that they got turned here and propagandized to the American people is that it besmirched his character, even as a suspected rapist.
The key thing that did it, that set the agenda, it's all about setting agendas, was, I've just got the headline now, was the thing here, 10 days in Sweden, Nick Davies, unseen police documents. Well, they clearly were seen by him. And of course, what I established in the article was that there were other police documents that were released around the same time in the same dossier that Davies deliberately did not use because they cast a different light on Assange. And at the time that he wrote that article, those documents, freedom of information, not really. He didn't refer to the existence of those other documents at all. So it was a deliberate hatchet job.
Do you know if the UK has something like they have here in the States, Operation Mockingbird, where the intelligence agencies deliberately own people in the media? Do you know if there's a name for that?
I don't know about own, but there are obviously security correspondents in each newspaper. First of all, secondly, each newspaper has an media outlet has somebody who will liaise with the secret services, but so they don't. And there have been reports by some journalists of being approached by the Secret Services and offered them money to go on the payroll, and they're the ones who've turned it down. So, although it might be called a specific operation, I think the idea that there are these close trend-setting connections. In fact, I was just reading something. There's a guy who you probably heard of. If you haven't, he's worth looking at, called Craig Murray, and he used to be a British ambassador to an obscure Russian or republic near Russia, I think Uzbekistan or somewhere. But anyway, he left the diplomatic service and he does a blog. And on his blog, he uncovers a lot of things of interest. And one of the things of interest he's uncovered, I was just reading it yesterday, is there's somebody who uses the name Philip Cross, who intervenes on Wikipedia sort of 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, attacking and sub-editing, changing the edits of anybody who's critical of the secret state. And what Murray drew attention to is that this guy, Philip Cross, has and he listed a load of media correspondents of newspapers and broadcasting organisations who were all subscribing to this Philip Cross's feed when there wasn't really much original to it. And he speculates that Philip Cross is probably just a cover name for the intelligence desk of one of the one of the intelligence agencies who's just pumping out propaganda, of which Wikipedia I think is full. I call it the fool's paradise. It's anything can appear on Wikipedia, and I don't really
interesting
set much store by it.
Well, I don't trust the Wikipedia either, but it's it's got an outline or a skeletal outline of people's biographies and stuff. But interestingly, I had a kind of run-in with The Guardian. I was quoted by them, and I had 2-hour-long interviews with their correspondent out here on the West Coast in San Francisco.
Oh, which correspondent was that?
I have to find it. I forgot his name. I remember his face. But it was when they quoted me, they quoted about 2 sentences and asked me and they were really prodding me for information, personal information, anything they could get. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that, because around the time of the nail bombings in London in 1999 that David Copeland was involved in, just after that, I had a journalist called Martin Bright, who was then working for The Guardian and The Observer, and he rang me up and he grilled me for about 2 hours on this story and other things. I mean, some questions I didn't want to answer, like the exact circulation of the magazine, but he gave me a real grilling. And at the end of it, I said, can you tell me which part of what I've said to you are you going to publish and in what kind of story? And he said, quick as a flash, oh no, I'm not going to publish any of this. And then you think to yourself, well, I won't swear, but then you think to yourself, why was he pumping me for 2 hours?
Right. Well, that's exactly how I felt after I got done talking with him. And I was going through my YouTube channel. I was giving him stats, and nothing showed up. The name of the article I was in, the guy's name is Paul Lewis from February 2nd, 2019.
Yeah.
So I talked with Paul Lewis for 2 hours, So the name of the article is Fiction is Outperforming Reality, How YouTube's Algorithm Distorts Truth. But, very interesting. But not really true. I think that it was a besmirch of independent journalists. I think is really what his goal was.
What is interesting, I'll just note that down.
Yeah, the name of the article, again, if any listener wants to read it, is Fiction is Outperforming Reality, How YouTube's Algorithm Distorts Truth by Paul Lewis, published in The Guardian, 2nd of February 2018. It's on theguardian.com. I'm looking at it right now.
Now, the reason why Paul Lewis is interesting, I'll just check. Because, as you might guess, if I have 10,000 books, I don't have them all to hand. But I'll just look, just to check something.
But it's funny, like I was talking to him, I gave him my background. I was an attorney. I have, I've written books. I'm an author, and they decided to call it William Ramsey and a cold investigator. It's just like, come on, man. This is like
Mind
one.
you,
Pardon me?
well, I have a feeling that Paul Lewis, I mentioned about the Guardian in particular going for defunct police squads. I think he co-authored a Guardian book on that very phenomenon.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so no surprise there.
Let's find out.
And
Online research.
To be fair, and I think before people are executed, you should always have a trial. To be fair, your symbol there of your
right
Skype symbol says Occult Hollywood.
Right. So I mean, that's my documentary. It's my documentary. Yeah. I did an occult. Right. So I've done part of my research. I've done true crime, a Crowley biography, another Crowley biography, a study of the smiley face killers, which is true crime, which is happening in the UK. Young men,
Alistair Crowley. I've read his stuff.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have as well. But anyway, so I mean, it's fair. If anything, if I pigeonholed anybody, did it to me, I did it to myself. But still, they could call me an author. The Guardian could at least say researcher, author, independent investigative journalist is probably fair, general enough. But I was underwhelmed by the whole experience of talking to the Guardian. I don't think I would talk to him again because I was really proffering information that I thought would be helpful. I was trying to be as transparent as possible in my mind. I was just answering his questions and everything.
You see, if he rang you up and he said, I'm ringing on behalf of MI5 or MI6, we just want to update our files, you'd have told him where to go, wouldn't you?
Yes, I would.
Yep. He rings you up and says he's from the Guardian, and people think, oh, it's like if people say, oh, I'm from the BBC. And a lot of people have a misguided view that the BBC is valid and neutral. I don't, but a lot of people do. I imagine particularly people in the US as well.
I would say so. I think that the corporate media or any state-associated media people are becoming more wise to. But they used to really trust the main corporate ABC, NBC, CBS used to be trusted. And now I think that really thinking people who are able to tell when people are lying to them, they don't have any. Those corporate media outlets don't have any credibility.
But I mean, there are some journalists who are quite good. I'm old enough to remember when the BBC's American correspondent was somebody called Charles Wheeler, and I always really rated him. I never liked Alistair Cook, I must admit, but Charles Wheeler, I always thought he was like. I saw a couple of things he did on American elections, just going around speaking to people, and I thought he was very courteous and measured and, genuinely informative. But, good journalists are in such a minority, you can remember the names.
Yeah, no, excellent point. That's very true. Very, very true. Unfortunately, that's this kind of sad state. Even when I was growing up, when I was younger, I remember most of these television journalists had some type of gravitas and were intelligent. They don't have it anymore. I can't even find one. I think it's, to do that job, somebody feeding you information, you have to be of a certain character, fortunately. Anyway, we kind of got off the beaten track. Do you want to talk anything about Assange, your investigation? I mean, your conclusion is that the charges were less than satisfactory. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. I'm just looking at it now. Yeah, no, I don't think the charges didn't add up.
Yeah, it kind of had an intel whiff of intelligence activity to me.
Yeah, that's right. And
so he's been targeted for 10 years, so it's been a decade for him.
Yeah. So. See, one of the interesting things about Davies, up until I did that article on him, which I know he was aware of, one of the interesting things about Davies is, up until that point, whenever anybody had a go at him, he'd have a go back. But he's never had a go back at me. But he did intervene in a number of forums. And what I did is I just took his defences of himself and just basically trashed them, basically. And he's not alone. It's just that Nick Davies had such a good reputation in this country, undeserved, particularly over the Maxwell stuff. I think
Interesting.
that you know, I thought it was time he was taken down a peg or two. He also, interestingly, Nick Davies, he has fronted some TV programs in the past, and one of the ones he fronted, Nick Davies made his career, and I do hope he listens to this and responds, but he's a gutless coward, so he won't. But one of the things that made Nick Davies' name in England in the early sort of 1980s is he did some stuff on police corruption.
Mm.
And of course, in the course of that, you know, one of the things is that these organisations, like the security services or the police, they aren't monolithic. So in other words, they have a command structure, and then they have the rank and file, and then they have the different stations, then they have the different units, and often they're all at odds with each other. And one thing that Nick Davies did is he was obviously given information by some people in the police regarding rogue informers who had infiltrated drugs gangs or had been members of drugs gangs and had been turned, who then, while they were on the police payroll, went and committed crimes. And so he publicised this. Obviously, some people in the police didn't like that. He publicised this. He made a reputation for it. Now, the reason why that's relevant is because one of the far-right groups we had in England in the early 1990s was a neo-Nazi group called Combat 18. The one stands for the first letter of the alphabet, and then the 8 is the H in the alphabet, i.e. Combat Adolf Hitler. And he actually produced a documentary in which he alleged that one of the leaders of this organisation had been a police informant. But I actually corresponded with him afterwards, and I said, Mr. Davies, can you tell me why, when you did stories on police informants in drugs gangs, you quoted their handlers' reports and this, that and the other to show they were on the payroll? Why did you not do this in the case of this man? And his response was, well, yeah, I know I didn't, but I was told it by people I had every reason to believe. Well, that's not real. That's not hard evidence. And of course, the irony of it is that there were police agents in that organisation, but I've got the idea that not the person he named as the agent, but somebody else was the agent. And therefore, in effect, Nick Davies and World in Action, was the documentary, were actually covering up for real agents.
Wow.
Nice.
Disinformation.
Nice. Disinformation.
It wasn't, but Combat 18 was kind of a serious unit, didn't they? Weren't there murders attributed to them?
Well, there was somebody who was on the fringes of Combat 18, Colin Ireland, I think a former soldier, which I think he was. He murdered a few gay people, but not under the direct aegis of the organisation. Then you've got the nail bombings that I talked about, with David Copeland.
Right.
But
in the intro,
that wasn't carried out by Combat 18 as such themselves. But one of the things that's interesting in relation to today is that Combat 18 produced very violent sounding publications with, lists of bomb making equipment, and they gave the home addresses of people who they didn't like. So they were obviously hoping that people might go and do something. Not very much happened. But what's interesting is that more recently, a group called National Action in the UK, they were actually banned, and they've been, they're a prescribed organisation. So being a member of it is enough to get somebody jailed.
Interesting.
Their language and their targeting of people was nowhere near as specific as Combat 18, which was never banned, and they have been. And I do wonder whether there's some kind of spurious evening up the balance going on between people who are Islamic jihadists, and they're trying to make out that the far right is as much of a threat as them. But in terms of the numbers of plots and people killed in the UK, it just doesn't compute.
The jihadis outnumber the right-wing radicals, correct? 10-1?
Yeah, and in particular in the plots. But you see, what they do, because they've outlawed national action, when they produce these statistics of, far-right extremism, that it's bumped it up because all somebody has to do is to be a member of it, an associate of it.
Right.
And there was a recent court case where somebody, after national action was banned, they continued to meet in various public houses, as most of these political groups spend their time in public houses, talking about what they're going to do next. In fact, there was a famous pamphlet written about the political left, not the right, a few years ago, and its title is "When This Pub Closes." In other words, when this pub closes, I'm going to do this, that, and the other, which they often never got round to. But anyway, after the group was banned, once somebody had been, they just used to meet to continue to drink and talk and whatever. One former member of the group, which didn't exist, came along to this pub meeting, and when they were all drunk, announced that he was going to get a machete and attack a Labour MP. Now, I think he probably was. And so what happened is an informant who was inside in the organisation, run by an organisation called Hope Not Hate, which is a sort of a state-linked pseudo-anti-extremist organisation. That informant went to the police. This guy, I mention his name because he's now in jail for it, Renshaw, got arrested. They went to his house. They found a machete. So I think it's reasonable to suppose that he hadn't bought the machete to trim the flowers or whatever.
Right.
He probably bought it to do what he was talking about. But the interesting thing was, charges were then brought against other people who'd been in the pub to try to make out it was a plot by them all to kill this MP. And even though it went to court twice, the jury threw it out. They didn't accept it.
Interesting.
So they got Renshaw quite rightly, but these other people, and also the jury didn't really accept that they were still members of this organisation. And even though the jury didn't accept it, the people who Hope Not Hate, who'd originally brought it to public light, still have produced a book called Nazi Terrorist. So most people would think that means there'd be evidence of Nazi terrorism in the book, and well, there wasn't really.
Do you know if they're reading or obtaining literature from the U.S. as well, like from Atomwaffen? I know that you and I offline have talked about some of these materials.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think the James Nolan Mason, I think his book, which you can't, as we discussed, you can't really get a hard copy of it. That was required reading for people.
Interesting. So even in the UK, so they're leaderless resistance, independent action, non-linear leadership, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, in terms of reading, but then the question is, what do they actually do? But yeah, certainly.
Right. Well, I know Atomwaffen is very serious. There's been 5 or 6 murders here in the States related to people who were involved directly in Atomwaffen. And there was one guy they know who was in Atomwaffen at this whole Charlottesville kerfluffle or whatever you want to call it, the weird nighttime torch marching and stuff like that, which, it's hard to believe happened.
I mean, I've got that. I did look at that. I mean, there were 2 people killed who were members of Atomwaffen who were killed by Devon Arthurs. And then I've got somebody else.
I don't know who's Devon Arthurs killed 2 members of Atomwaffen?
Yeah, of his own organisation.
I didn't know that.
That's they're classed as 2 of the murders. Whereas I think you might call that blue on blue. I don't know whether you would.
I know that there was one death here in Los Angeles. The young guy took a Jewish man out to the woods and killed him.
That was Blaise Bernstein.
Yeah, Blaise Bernstein.
Now, you see, one thing I did is I looked at that and I thought, yeah, that's obviously, reprehensible. But then what I did, just as a matter of interest, is I looked up the number of murders that there were in that there have been in the US recently, and it may well not be as high as it has been, but I've got for 2016 17,413 murders, 2017 17,294, and thankfully a slight decline in 2018, 16,214. So I think we shouldn't probably let this get out of perspective. I think there are all kind of complex reasons about why people might be attracted to, right-wing groups to do with...
Yeah, the far right. I would call Adam Waffen very far right. I've seen some of their videos. They're not on... They got kicked off of YouTube, but they're on BitChute, and they are deranged. They are really crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see, what is particularly interesting there is, apart from the kind of Nazi aspect to it, there's that kind of Nazi satanic influence. And they have a situation where there's somebody who's long interested me in the UK called David Myatt. He was involved.
Yes, I know Myatt. I've read about Myatt.
Yeah, well, he was involved in Combat 18, interestingly. He's been in and out of so many different groups.
Yeah, he became Islamic for a while or some form.
Yeah. And he had his organisation, the Order of the Nine Angles, and currently he claims that he's not involved in anything of that sort. But you know what? He's had so many different changes of skin over the years. These people are way beyond any concept of truth. So really, anything they say...
it's kind of like camouflage, yeah. It's
yeah.
No, it's very remarkable. Myatt's been around for a long time. But
he has.
The occult. One of the things of my interest in Adam Waffen really was after seeing their materials and the occultism that is prevalent in all their materials is really pretty shocking for me. So I was surprised to see that. I didn't know that. Adam Waffen really is a right-wing occult group, no question, in my mind.
Yeah, and there was some members of National Action, like there's somebody called Ryan Fleming who uses the pseudonym A.A. Moraine. He was involved in Atomwaffen sort of internationally. And there is a small couple of youngsters, I'd call them, in their early 20s, who were jailed for a group called Sonnenkrieg, which is like Sun War, which is a kind of an Atomwaffen spin-off. Huh. But you see, one of the things that interested me about them, and this is the comparison with Combat 18, is that they were jailed because they put forward propaganda urging people to, attack individual policemen who they named. But the address they gave was the address of the police station where he worked. So what I'm thinking is, right, so they didn't give his home address. They didn't do anything themselves. Talk is cheap. Whereas Combat 18 did attack some people in their homes and did print home addresses, and they were never banned. So the actual threshold for banning people now in the UK seems to be a lot lower than it used to be. And I'm always in two minds about banning groups, because if you ban groups, then you drive them underground. Many people might give up, but then those people who are into their mindset, it might just glamorize them in their own mind. It might encourage them to carry out extreme acts. I think you've got to be looking at further down the chain about what is it that drives people to have such desperate lives that they're drawn towards this kind of stuff. I think that's maybe...
That's good. That's a good point. I mean, I think it's some kind of perception that they're under attack, so they have to join these violent supremacy groups, something like that. Some feeling of insecurity, I would say.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, he was often said about, I'm not sure whether it's true or not at all, that a lot of the members of the National Action, were alleged to be personal inadequates. I'm not sure whether they are. But even if they were, then that's something to do with the society then, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say so. I would definitely say so.
Or
Do you have, we're kind of at 45 minutes, do you have any thoughts on the current Assange situation in perspective of your paper on those rape allegations?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that he's going to, he's obviously, in the end, he's going to end up in the US, which is what he predicted anyway. And of course, it's way beyond him. It's a kind of message to anybody who might want to uncover things that the state doesn't want uncovered.
It's an excellent point. Yes.
That we're going to get you.
Yeah, well, he was the number one target. So we'll see what happens in the future. I mean, he was so important to the 2016 election, and it's still going on right now. They're still prosecuting Roger Stone, this kind of right-wing political operative, for whether he was getting information from WikiLeaks. So the WikiLeaks is tied to Seth Rich. It's tied to Hastings, another guy who was killed in the States. Had a car crash.
See, one thing I find slightly amusing, really, is if you live long enough, things come full circle. So when I was growing up in the 1970s and first interested in politics, one of the standard themes was that the British left was said to be infiltrated and in the pay of the Russians. Whereas now it seems to be people are saying it's actually the British right and the American right are in the pay of the Russians. But of course, what also interests me is that essentially I think that people who've got lots of money are seeking to influence politics, throughout the world.
Yes.
And certain triggers to avoid themselves being subject to scrutiny. So, I mean, as you probably know, we had the referendum in this country on Britain membership of the European Union or not.
Yes.
Now, again, when I was growing up, opposition to the EU was a staple point of people on the left. And I've never seen any reason to change my viewpoint, and that's the viewpoint I still hold to. But of course, since we had the referendum, there has been big money poured into pressure groups who want to keep Britain in the EU, in particular by somebody whose name might ring a bell, George Soros.
Right.
And whenever it's almost implied that the only people who have a problem with George Soros influencing British politics are people on the right. Well, I'm not on the right, and not only do I have a problem with him, I actually remember, which people should, in the early 1990s, Britain was loosely aligned to a European Union monetary system, and they left it in pretty short time. But as their currency was in a bit of crisis and they left it, George Soros intervened on the money markets and took millions and millions of pounds from the British taxpayers by speculating against the currency. And people seem to have forgotten that. And also, I've looked into something. George Soros is known for giving lots of money to philanthropic foundations worldwide. As he calls it, they're perceived by people at the other end as interfering in politics. But I also saw at the same time where he hadn't paid many taxes for many years, and he reached some kind of arrangement with the your revenue authorities to make some kind of payments and let him off the rest. So basically, George Soros is not paying the taxes that he should, and he's using it to interfere in politics in different countries. Whoever does it, I don't agree with it. I don't agree with the Russians doing it. I don't agree with Soros doing it. Whoever it is, I don't agree with it. But
right. Makes perfect sense. Is there anything that I've missed or anything you'd like to follow up, end up with?
No, just to say that in the next issue of the magazine, we're going to be writing quite a bit about national action and the banning of it, and we will be using some intelligence reports which we've obtained, shall we say, in inverted commas, concerning the running of agents. So we'll be outing a number of agents, and we'll be outing some of the people financing them, and I think that will cause a little bit of controversy. Good. Which is what we like.
Good. Well, again, it's Larry O'Hara. The website is Notes from the Borderland. It's borderland.co.uk, BORDERLAND, all one word, .co.uk. Again, Notes from the Borderland, the UK's premier parapolitical magazine. And we were talking generally about an article that's in Borderland
Issue
11. Correct.
Issue 11.
I wanted to talk, maybe another time we can talk about the Gareth Williams situation,
the
young man who was found in...
that's right, that's recently come into the news as well again here. But the other thing I would say is we encourage people to try and buy a hard copy of the magazine, because we don't put everything on the website, because we know that the web, in a flick of a switch, a website can be gone.
Yep.
Once you've got hard copies, are rather more difficult to disappear.
Yeah, good point. Excellent point. Larry O'Hara, thank you so much for the interview.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. All right, I just...